Good afternoon or morning to our attendees, and welcome to the 2015 NCPERS Legislative Outlook. The theme of our live webcast is Elections Have Consequences, and we're going to be spending the bulk of our time over the next hour talking about what the potential election consequences may mean for public sector pension plans throughout the United States, as well as federal legislation. I am very excited to be joined today by our distinguished panelists. To my immediate left is Bailey Childers, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition. And to my far left is Tony Roda, partner in the Washington, D.C. based tax law and lobbying firm of Williams & Jensen. So in terms of the agenda for the next hour, the first 15 minutes, we're going to do a review of legislation that was considered or enacted in 2014 at the state level as well as here in Washington, D.C. Then in the second quarter, we're going to be talking about the midterm elections in 2014. The third quarter of our hour, we're going to be talking about the consequences of that midterm election, again at the federal level and in Congress, as well as select states throughout the union. Then the remaining 15 minutes we will devote to responding to your questions. So let me begin by turning it over to Bailey to talk in a minute by introducing us to the National Public Pension Coalition, for those of you who may not be familiar, and asking her to tell us a little bit about what she does.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today, Hank. I appreciate it. And Tony, great to be on the panel with you. So the National Public Pension Coalition is an advocacy organization at the national level that works to monitor legislation all across the country at the state level on what's happening with public pensions. And our mission is to provide assistance and support to states to help them defeat bad legislation against pensions anywhere that it comes up. So we will work to help state partners put together a coalition, help them think through their campaign plan, provide funding if that's necessary for the campaign, work with them on their press and communication strategy. Any way we can be of assistance, we want to help states beat legislation that's harmful to public employees in the state. So that's our goal, that's what we're here to do, and I'm really excited to be here. And of course, if anything comes out of this in different states that we're not already in touch with, definitely want to get in touch with those folks so we can be of help.
Great, thank you, Bailey, and that sounds like a big job. Tony, can you tell us a little bit more about Williams & Jensen and your role in terms of what you do for NCPERS and other public pension clients that you have?
Absolutely, Hank, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. And Bailey, it's great to be working with you. Well, Williams & Jensen was founded back in 1970, and we're about 20 partners. And we have, since 2002, really focused on public pension work. It started with a project with the Houston Firefighters Retirement Fund, which we still represent today, NCPERS then. We started to work with Hank and his team. We will also work with Ohio Police and Fire and the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement Systems. What we do essentially is cover the waterfront on federal legislation before all the key committees, the tax writing committees and the other pension committees, the labor committees. And we also watch very carefully the regulatory front. And we will meet on the Hill, we will meet with the Treasury and IRS officials and try to advance the agenda for public pension plans and defeat and push back on negative regulations or legislation.
And as you well know, I think the interest here in Washington, D.C. on public plan has grown exponentially over the last handful of years. So we really appreciate your service here in D.C. So because public plans are creatures of state and local governments, I think it's apropos to talk or begin the conversation with a review of what happened at the states in 2014. So Bailey, what are some of the legislation that were enacted or were considered, and which states were the ones that you had or NPPC had the most concerns about in 2014?
Sure. Well, just looking at the start of 2014, we were very concerned about what was going to go on in the states. Detroit bankruptcy happened. There were several other negative things that happened toward the end of 2013. So it looked like 2014 was going to be a challenging year, and it was. There were there were battles in a lot of states to, look at putting new employees into a 401k style system, or cutting benefits for current retirees or people who are already in the system. So we knew it was going to be a challenging year. What I'm happy to report is that on the whole, we did pretty well working in coalition in a lot of different states at stopping a lot of the bad legislation. I'll start with the loss first, and then I'll talk about the happier stuff. So unfortunately in Oklahoma, that is one state that we were not successful at stopping legislation. So there was a proposal in Oklahoma to move new state employees into a 401k style system. And unfortunately, I believe it's the Oklahoma Public Employees Association, which is not an affiliated member of the National Public Pension Coalition or our state coalition in Oklahoma. Their employees agreed to take, I believe it was a 2% pay increase, and agreed to the change in the system. So
which
that
was a 401k.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So it was an unfortunate, folks in the state didn't stay united together. Now that legislation is pending in a lawsuit right now. So our coalition, even though there are members of our coalition who were not impacted by the legislation, so this was only state employees, it wasn't teachers and firefighters, our state coalition has still decided to pursue a lawsuit there, and so that legislation is pending. We're hopeful that we'll get a good ruling, but are also concerned, which I'll talk about later, about what Oklahoma will do this year. Okay. Illinois is another place that we have legislation pending, or in the courts. We challenged what they did at the state level and in Chicago this year. So those are two that we'll keep an eye on. And now in good places, again, there were other states that moved to do the similar, moving folks into the 401k style system. In Florida, that was beat, for example. In California, we were successful at stopping a couple of local ballot measures to do similar kinds of things. And I think the biggest victory that I'm really thrilled with and think is a good story for us as we talk to people about this is Arizona. So in Phoenix, there was a ballot measure that made it all the way to the ballot. Folks voted on it in November, and that was to move Phoenix public employees into a 401k style system, and the voters said no. I think that's a really big thing for us to look at, because this is the actual voters deciding, how they feel about whether public employees should be getting, a defined benefit where, they're getting a secure retirement at the end of their term of service to the state, and voters sided with public employees. So I think that's really exciting and a good place for us to look as we move into this year.
Great. Tony, how about here in Washington, D.C., what Congress obviously more recently is known as the Do Nothing Congress, but I think there were some activities that you were keeping an eye on?
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to say, the work that Bailey's group does at the state level is very important, because often public pensions are portrayed as just a few funds that are struggling. And the vast majority are in very good shape. And for Bailey's group to be getting the word out, all these newspapers and articles are read by folks in the federal Congress as well. So, well, I think Hank summed it up. Looking back at 2014, it was more of a posturing and politicking Congress than it was a legislating one. And on the politicking side, I would say that the Republicans did better. I know we're going to talk about the elections and the results of that a little later. There were a couple of pieces of legislation that we were looking at very closely. One was introduced by now Senate Finance Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch of Utah, S 1270. And only Title I of that bill deals with public pension plans. But it is a new approach. It's one where annuities would essentially replace a defined benefit plan going forward. We have real concerns about that, particularly with regard to whether replacement income is going to be anywhere near what it would be with a well-funded DB plan. On the public safety side, we have concerns about the lack of survivor and disability benefits. So we're very much keeping an eye on that legislation. And I know that'll be a subject of your conference, Hank, in a couple weeks. Also, Chairman Camp, who is now retired from Congress and in the private sector, released in the mid part of the year a tax reform blueprint. And the tax reform blueprint did have some issues of concern, I think, also to public pension plans. One deals with the unrelated business income tax, which we will have to look at and watch going forward. Another dealt with any special rules related to 457Bs or 403B plans are under scrutiny, and we should be aware of that. And we don't know where Chairman Ryan, now Chairman Ryan of the House Ways and Means Committee, will go with the draft, but he is certain, of course, to look at the ideas that have already been put forward. Another piece of legislation that's been out there now for 3 Congresses is the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which would require state and local governmental plans to report for the first time to the Federal Treasury Department on their funded status. It's not just their funded status based on their own market rate of return, but it's also based on the Treasury yield curve. So those numbers are going to look much lower on the funding level and are of a concern to us as well.
So maybe you could tease out a little bit more, or first let me ask you this, which is, in terms of the concerns that you raised, the 3 concerns in Congress, how would you prioritize them?
Well, I think tax reform, it's hard to know which direction that is going to take, and that we can talk more during the discussion of 2015. But okay. There are going to be so many pieces with tax reform that I think we have to be very careful about it. But I would put on top of the list Senator Hatch's legislation, and that is because he's the chairman of the committee and has every opportunity to move the bill. So we really do need to raise the concerns that we have and hopefully see that they are addressed.
Okay. And Bailey, again, in terms of review of 2014, you did mention Oklahoma as a loss, but and you talked in brief about a handful of other states, but I think, if I recall, there were about 11 states where we had serious concerns, and of the 11 where we, where we just lost one. Again, given the context of what you talked about at the end of 2013, with the Detroit bankruptcy being, the bankruptcy judge ruling that pensions could be part of the negotiations, as well as the legislation in Illinois that you referenced, it really did set a bad sort of framework in terms of conversation in 2014. So, I think NPPC should be commended for the fact that, while we did lose Oklahoma, the fact that we maintained 10 states, in this line of work, sometimes a push is a win, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, so let's start talking a little bit about the midterm. So Tony, what happened in Congress in terms of the makeup of Congress with the November midterm elections?
Well, we'll start with the House, Hank, where no one expected the House Republicans to lose the majority, and in fact they did not. They added appreciably to their seats. In fact, until Congressman Grimm of New York decided that he could not serve in the current Congress because of federal charges. They briefly had the highest number of House Republicans since 1928, the 69th Congress. So it was a tremendous watershed victory for the House Republicans. Now they're at 246 seats, just one off because of the vacancy, and that still is a watershed number because that goes back to 1948. They have not had that many House Republicans since 1948, the 80th Congress. So in the Senate, we, a lot of prognosticators believed that the Senate would flip. There were so many very close races that, up until the last few days, it was really not clear. But the Senate indeed, given the seats that were up, the Senate did flip to a majority Republican control, as we all know, and the seats are 54 to 46. So the Republicans are in a position where they have to be the governing party with the president, of course. But they have to prove that they can govern. They have to be productive. And I think they're looking at this as very much a lead up to the 2016 election. And if they can do things in Congress that are productive and appreciated by the American people, I think they feel they have a very good shot at winning in the 2016 presidential election as well. Now, did it get off to a rocky start? The votes against the Speaker were 25 or so Republicans who voted against Speaker Boehner. There's a little divisiveness over how to proceed on the immigration issue, which has nothing to do with public pensions, but is somewhat indicative of how difficult it is to control both chambers. I think for their purposes, looking at the future as they're going to do over the next 2 days at the retreat in Hershey, Pennsylvania is very important. We'll see how they come out. They'll try to tamp down any policy disagreements, but members of Congress have the voting card and the microphone, and they will ultimately do what they believe is right. But you know, they do have to be careful. 2016, there are going to be 24 Republican Senate seats up, only 10 Democratic seats, and in 7 of the Republican seats, President Obama carried those states both times he ran. So there is concern, but they have to be very, I would say, mindful of the next election as well.
So before we start talking about what the impact of the midterms were in the state legislatures and governorships, let's stay with the federal government for just a little bit longer. And as I know most audience members know, there is, again, fairly limited profile or exposure for public sector pension plans at the federal level. And it largely deals with the tax provisions of public sector pension plans. And as a result, the most focus that we pay in terms of committees in Congress are the tax writing committees. So, Tony, you mentioned Senator Orrin Hatch, the new incoming, or I guess the chair, excuse me, of the Senate Finance Committee. And given his SAFE legislation, we have a fairly good understanding of what his positions are or what his views are on public sector pension plans. Do we have something similar to that in terms of a window to what Chairman Ryan might be thinking?
You know, I've heard Chairman Ryan speak, and I've spoken to him about pension issues, and he is very much of the mind, and this was echoed by Senator Hatch recently. You know, there's been this discussion on tax reform about where do we get the money to pay for the lower rates. And some have thought, well, why don't we just lower the contribution levels for DB and DC plans? We'll take the money from that because the deferrals won't be there. We'll have extra revenue to play with for the rates. Senator Hatch recently came out and said that would be foolish and short-sighted. I've heard the same thing from Chairman Ryan prior to his becoming chairman. But I think retirement is very much a priority to the extent that we can educate the members of the committee, including the chairman, about the importance of defined benefit plans to Main Street America. Because I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact that the retirees who stay in their communities are those who want to go to the same Main Street stores that they've always been going to. And if we jeopardize those retirement funds, then I think we're putting Main Street businesses in trouble.
Yeah, and you know, one of the positive potentials here is that Chairman Ryan is from Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin systems are one of the best run, well-funded plans that we have. So hopefully he'll have that perspective as he considers legislation in the House. So how about at the state level, Bailey? What did the 2014 election yield for us there?
Unfortunately, as folks on the phone probably, or in the webcast probably know, the 2014 elections at the state level, I don't have a lot of good stuff to report. But maybe I'll try. Pennsylvania, we won the Democrats won the governor's race. I don't think that means, by any means, we're getting a free pass on pensions this year. We're actually very concerned. I can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about our forecast, but that's one to keep, even though we won the governor's race, still pretty high on our watch list that we're concerned about. The rest are just states that we're going to be concerned about. So Nevada is one in particular. Both chambers flipped in Nevada. That's gone completely Republican. Very concerned about what that's going to look like for pensions this year. Colorado, we lost the Senate in Colorado, so that's another state that we're going to be keeping an eye on to see what kind of movement's going to come out of the new chamber.
And the lower chamber, what's the composition or the
It's
majority?
Democratic, but
Okay.
But the Senate is Republican in
Okay.
Colorado. Illinois is going to be tough. Quinn lost re-election in Illinois. I think part of that could have been the positions he took on pensions, but unfortunately his opponent, Rauner, is probably worse. I mean, he's been pretty clear that he thinks the system should be moved to a 401k style defined contribution system. So Illinois is going to be a challenging state. You know, no matter how the lawsuit comes out, it's still going to be very challenging in Illinois. And West Virginia, we lost a chamber there. I haven't heard any alarm bells from West Virginia yet, but that's one we'll keep an eye on as well. So on the whole, Republicans at the state level won a lot of chambers. A lot of things did not go very well as far as public pensions. So we will have another very challenging year.
Okay. Right.
But again, thank goodness for the ballot measure in Phoenix. So one bright spot in the elections.
Great. So let's then shift gears and let's spend the bulk of our time talking about the consequences of elections. So I think for a number of reasons, my personal view is that not since the 2010-2011 have we had as much concerns at the federal and the state level in terms of public sector pension plans. So Bailey, let me start it off with you again. What are the consequences? What can we expect? What are some of the intelligence that you're hearing from your coalition members at the state level?
Sure. So let me just start with Pennsylvania, since I talked about that briefly with the election results. So the kind of opening salvo in Pennsylvania from the Republican leadership in the State House was they're not going to give on tax revenue, probably through a fracking tax, until the governor agrees to come to the table on pensions. So that's something that we're concerned about in Pennsylvania. It's not entirely clear how serious that threat is, but it's definitely something we want to look into and make sure that we're prepared to help in any way we can. So Pennsylvania, I would say that's probably over the last week or so, has really started to move up on our watch list. Indiana is another state that we're very concerned about. We thought Indiana was going to be okay this year, but we've gotten word that it looks like there will be bills moving to shift from defined benefit to a 401k style plan in Indiana. We're very concerned about that. We've got a call on Friday with local folks to really start seeing how we can activate and try to prevent that. So Indiana's another state that we're very concerned about. Nevada, as I mentioned, we remain concerned about. Arizona, unfortunately, even though the ballot measure was successful, the mayor of Phoenix is still wanting to consider changes to the pension system, potentially even going back at a 401k style plan, even though that lost at the ballot box. So Phoenix.
So introducing legislation or potential code through the city council or something?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And it's also not clear statewide what Arizona will do, but we're concerned about Arizona. Let's see, Colorado, I think, one of the kind of interesting things that states will do if they're not quite ready yet to introduce a change is they'll do a study commission, right? To say, what does the health of the system look like? What are the recommendations we can make? What should we be doing to change it? Colorado, I believe, has 3 studies that will come out starting in June of this year throughout the rest of the year, looking at different aspects of the Colorado system. So we're really working to talk about, switching from defined benefit to defined contribution is costly. It doesn't solve problems of an unfunded liability. It's not allowing workers to retire securely. I thought, Tony, your point actually was great about local businesses and retirees. If they're not getting the basics they need to buy food and take care of themselves in retirement, that is going to hurt those Main Street businesses where those folks would be shopping or going to the diner or wherever. So looking at all of those different kind of things, we want to make sure those messages are getting out in Colorado in advance of whatever the studies say, knowing that we may have a fight on our hands in the following legislative session. Other states we're keeping an eye on. I could probably go on for this for a long time, so just feel free to tell me to stop. Kansas, Governor Brownback, not my favorite. That was one of my big disappointments in the election. I thought maybe we would get him because of his reckless tax policy, but shockingly, Kansas has a deficit that they need to do something about because of Brownback's tax policies. So the pension system is one place he started to look at cuts and rollbacks. So Kansas is a concern. Florida will be keeping an eye on. Even though Florida was successful last year, their state legislature just seems to do the same thing every year. So we'll continue to support them in any way we can. Michigan is another state that is gearing up for a battle. Thankfully, we were concerned in their lame duck session at the end of last year that something might move. Thankfully, nothing did. There was, I believe, just one hearing in a committee, but the bill didn't move beyond that. So Michigan is another place that we'll be keeping an eye on. New Jersey, I think New Jersey is interesting in a different way because of Chris Christie and whatever he decides to do, if he decides to do anything on the national stage, and how his rhetoric plays into pensions at the national level. So that's a concern for me, especially just because of him. And then I think Oklahoma, like I mentioned, even though the lawsuit is pending, there does seem to be some interest among state legislatures at going back to move more public workers into a 401k style plan. So they may do that before the lawsuit. They may do it, depending on the outcome of the lawsuit. But we're keeping an eye on it there. So maybe I'll stop there, and then if there are other states on the phone that have questions, we could get to that. But I think that's a pretty.
That's 9.
We've got a lot that we're looking at, yes.
So Bailey, before I turn it over to Tony, let me ask you this, which is, you kind of alluded to it, but in terms of your interactions or crossing swords with some of the think tanks and foundations out there, those that are advocating for conversion to a 401k for public employees or a cash balance type of plan. Or some other combination type of plans. What are you seeing from the likes of the Koch brothers or the Arnold Foundation, et cetera?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, we're seeing them get more sophisticated, more coordinated, and dropping some serious money into some states. So on the first point of getting more sophisticated, I would encourage everybody on this webcast to take a look at the Colorado Pension Project's website. So this is a John Arnold funded group that has started to message in Colorado, which is another part of our concern with the studies that are coming out there. Their website is very slick, very professional, and their messaging has shifted a little bit to talk about how pensions are bad for teachers because, if they don't stay in their job, they can't take their pension with them. And they've got some very nuanced messaging that we haven't seen before, trying to talk about why teachers themselves should not want a pension. So that's really concerning to us to see if that's going to catch on in other states. They also, to speak of the Koch brothers, I want to say it's either 10 or 12 million, somewhere around abouts in there, they've put into Pennsylvania for the legislative session this year. And that's on pensions, privatization, and I believe paycheck deception. So they are all in Pennsylvania, which is another reason that state has really moved up the list of states that we're concerned about. And then in Illinois, for example, Rauner has a lot of his own money, so he's put $20 million into a legislative fund to try to pressure state legislators to go along with whatever he decides to do in his legislative agenda. And so that's concerning, knowing there would be people up for re-election in 2 years, and he may have a way to pressure them, that's not coming from the other side. So those are some troubling trends. The other thing that John Arnold and his folks are starting to do, they find academic institutions to give money to that then, surprisingly, there comes out a study about how bad the pension system is in the state or why moving to a 401k style system would be good for the state. So we've tried to do our best to expose that and to let states know, state lawmakers know, if these folks are coming to talk to you and are pushing this is a national concerted effort, and we want to make sure they understand they're not looking at what's best for your local state. These are national folks that are pushing an agenda that's far right-wing, and we want to make sure state lawmakers know that because often that helps us bring some of the moderate folks back to the table to do something more reasonable. So it's a big concern, though. John Arnold has put $53 million of his own money into attacking public employee pensions all across the country.
So Tony, how about here in D.C.? What do you see for 2015?
I want to do this somewhat in reverse because I mentioned all the negative when I talked about the 2014 pieces of legislation. But there are two pieces of legislation on the congressional radar screen that are very positive. One was introduced at the end of last Congress by Senator Kelly Ayotte, a Republican of New Hampshire. And what it would do is clarify that state-based survivor benefits in the line of duty are indeed federally tax exempt. And this has become an issue in her state, but perhaps in other states where there's been some confusion with the IRS as to the tax status of this particular type of payment. So that's very positive. Congressman Eric Paulson, a Republican from Minnesota, introduced the companion bill in the House. The other is introduced by Congressman Dave Reichert of Washington State, former sheriff, and a member who does a great deal with the public safety community and should be commended for those efforts. And his bill would expand an exemption that is in the current tax code on an early withdrawal penalty for public safety employees. He would expand it to federal, include federal public safety employees, and also to distributions from defined contribution plans in addition to defined benefit plans. So those two pieces of legislation are very positive and things that NCPERS supports and that we'll work forward for their passage. We're going to have the carryover issues that I talked about. We're going to have Senator Hatch's legislation. We're going to have tax reform in whatever shape that takes. And at the Republican retreat this week, they are going to talk a lot about where to do tax reform and how to do it. There's skepticism as to whether it can be done, whether politically it's too heavy a lift, and whether the president has an appetite to do it. But that is left to be seen. The Republicans first have to structure an idea as to how to do it, a strategy. One thought is to use budget reconciliation, which sounds very arcane, but is simply the statutory changes needed to enforce the budget resolution, which Congress passes but does not go to the president. The reconciliation bill does go to the president. So that is how the Affordable Care Act was passed into law. There's some thought that tax reform will be done in the same way. Budget reconciliation, in the House, it's a simple majority vote. In the Senate, of course, with the need for cloture and the cutoff filibuster, a 60-vote margin we always talk about, the reconciliation bill is free from that. The reconciliation bill can be passed by simple majority under an expedited floor consideration. So it's a powerful tool, and we're going to see if that is the direction tax reform takes. If it does, of course, we have to be very careful about the provisions that I mentioned earlier and anything else that could be added to it. We will probably see reintroduction of the Pepto legislation, the shorthand for the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. And we will probably see, on the regulatory front, perhaps some action. We haven't talked about that yet, but there are several items pending at the Treasury and IRS that are of great interest to the public pension community. One dealing with the definition. You can't get more fundamental than what the definition is of a state or local governmental plan. And in 2011, Treasury released an advance notice on that definition. It wasn't even a proposed rule. But that notice received 2,300 comments. So there's great interest, as you can tell. The other is regulations dealing with normal retirement age, which really have been on our radar screen since they came out in May 2007. And we have been successful on behalf of the state and local community, governmental plan community, to push the effective date of these regulations as they would be applicable to state and local plans forward. Right now we're waiting for revisions to the rules, and we have every belief that we're going to be supportive of those revisions because we've seen an indication in a Treasury notice that some of the questions that we had would be answered the way we would like them answered. But until you see the actual proposed rule, you just don't know. So those are some of the items that I think we're going to be dealing with.
So maybe just for the sake of the audience, please tease out for us in terms of tax reform, What are sort of the broad strokes of that? I mean, are they trying to raise the revenue? Are they not trying to raise the revenue? What is it about tax reform? Or maybe the simpler question is, why do we need tax reform?
I think the driving, well, of course you could always say you need tax reform because of the complexity of the Internal Revenue Code, and that is a fact. So for that reason alone, you need tax reform. Whether tax reform actually simplifies the code or not is another question. But beside that, you have a structure on the corporate side where our businesses are under a 35% rate. And businesses in other countries are not. You see all the headlines about companies inverting so that they can, in fact, take advantage of a lower tax bracket in another country. That is a concern, and it's a concern I think shared by Democrats and Republicans. And everyone wants in the U.S. a business climate where we can grow, where manufacturing could grow, where manufacturing shouldn't be looking for another jurisdiction to incorporate or do business. So that's a very important factor in tax reform. Now, to get there, you have to raise revenue elsewhere. And that was the question and the very positive reaction, actually, from Chairman Hatch and Ryan about, no, we're not going to pay for anything. We're not going to go after contributions to retirement plans.
Well, what about specifically for the public sector, which is the pickup? And there's a revenue loss because of the pickup. And the pickup, for folks who don't know the jargon, is it's a special provision in the IRS code to allow employee contributions into public sector pension plans to be made on a pre-tax basis, like contributions into 401ks. And so are there any chatter about making modifications to the pickup rule?
There have been over the years. Right now, things are fairly quiet on the pickup, but there is an issue, a regulatory issue, that could spill over into Congress as to the flexibility of the pickup in a situation where your state or municipality has added a tier and would like to have an election of existing employees into the new tier. The current IRS guidance says that that is not permissible. So there are jurisdictions and states that are concerned about that. The pickup was scored, revenue score, by the Joint Tax Committee probably 4 years ago now. And repeal of the pickup would actually generate $5 billion over 10 years. Okay, it's $5 billion. That's real money certainly to all of us. In the guise of tax reform, in the context of tax reform, it's a small amount. So, you know, to answer your question, I have not heard specific efforts on the pickup, but the Joint Tax Committee score is there. And there's this other side issue as to the flexibility of it.
Right. And I guess before we turn it over to questions, the final comment I would make is in regard to some activity in Congress that occurred in the lame duck session in December. We got a lot of calls that confused a provision in the Budget Reconciliation Act that funds the federal government for this fiscal year, which allowed private sector multiple employer plans to gain some flexibility in terms of pension payments. Now, the phone call that we were getting was a lot of folks in the public sector space thought that this piece of legislation was impacting public sector plans. And so let me reiterate that provision does not apply to public sector plans and is in fact limited to severely distressed plans in the private sector multi-employer space. So we have about 20 minutes. Let's turn it over to some of the questions from the audience. And the first goes to you, Bailey. In terms of tactics at the state and local level, what have been the more successful ones to prevent public plans from getting converted into 401ks?
That's a great question, Hank. I think one of the best things that we can do is look for what I like to call the personal stories, right? So find a public employee or a retiree who's willing to share their story about what that pension really means to them, that this is covering their basics in retirement, and talk about their service to the state and the years of work that they put in, in whatever kind of service to the state that might have been, whether it's teaching or, filling potholes or plowing the roads when it's snowing or helping people who are unemployed find work, or fighting fires, or protecting the streets, any of those things. Having a worker or a retiree talk about themselves, their story, what they've given to the state and the community, and why that pension is so valuable to them for meeting their basic needs in retirement and taking care of their families in retirement. We found that that's a really good way to kind of, open the door with legislators and just talk about the real people that are going to be impacted by any changes they would make to the pension system. So that's my number one, is finding those kind of local stories. Did you have a question, or do you want? I've got a couple other ideas.
No, go ahead. Yeah,
oh yeah,
please.
sure.
Yeah.
I think another important thing is looking for third-party validators, and what we mean by that is, not a union, and maybe not necessarily someone from one of the retirement systems, but somebody else who can talk about why this matters. And what I loved, again, to go back to Tony's comment, maybe it's a local business. Maybe there's a diner owner who's willing to say, look, I depend on the folks who come in here every day to have breakfast for my own livelihood. So why do we want to be, stealing their benefits in retirement that they earned over a lifetime? So I think that's another great place to go. And there's also looking for research projects that can be done in the state that, I think it's a good press hook when you're releasing new research. New data is always interesting to folks. It gives you something different to talk about. And, we've got lots of different examples that states can look at if that's something they're interested in, that other states have taken part in throughout the last couple of years. But it's a great way to kind of change the conversation. Again, another way to get in the door with legislators, and a good press hook.
Okay. So, Tony, we got a comment. We had a little, I think, audio technical difficulty when you were talking about the federal, the Pepto legislation. So could you quickly go over Pepto once more?
Sure. Pepto is the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. It was introduced in the last Congress. It was the third Congress in a row that it's been introduced. What it would do, it would require plan sponsors to report to the Treasury Department, the Federal Treasury Department, as to their funded status. It would the reports would come in two sets. First would be based on the fund's market rate of return, long-term rate of return. The second would be based on a calculation of assets as if they were on a Federal Treasury yield curve, a bond curve, so that the return on the bond curve is going to be much less than the assumed rate of return of the funds. So you're going to have a great disparity in the funded status between those two sets of numbers. With the new GASB numbers coming out, at some point, how many numbers do you need? And that's a point that we make in Congress as well. I mean, does this just lead to confusion? And bad headlines, which really, in reality, don't demonstrate the real funded status of the plan. The other thing about Pepto is the plan sponsor is certainly on the hook to make the reports. Failing to do so means that the sponsor loses its ability to issue federally tax-exempt bonds. That's a big hammer. The reports will be made. You can guarantee that. Yeah.
So, Tony, you did mention that NCPERS will be hosting our joint healthcare symposium and legislative conference January 25th through the 28th. So with that background, what would you advise state and local plans in terms of reaching out to their federally elected officials while they're here in town, as well as continuing to make outreach and connections with their elected officials?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an opportunity that the plans really should take advantage of when they're here in Washington. We like to look at Congress as if it's some big mechanical institution and you push a button and something happens on the other side, but it's an institution run by people. And it's people who know other people. And if the members of Congress don't have a relationship with their state and local fund, that's a problem, because then the only information they're going to get is from the headlines, which are almost always negative, or through their own research, which is probably not going to be as sufficient as if the executive director or the trustee sat before the member or their staff and explained the situation of the fund and what's important to the fund. So I think it's very important to get out and about and see members of Congress while you're here in Washington, or even back in the districts, if that can't be arranged. They all have district offices. They're all back in their districts at least probably maybe 40% of the year. So it's very important. The other thing I'd stress is particularly on public safety plans. The two positive pieces of legislation I pointed out are public safety. The Republicans' ties to the public safety community are very strong and should be even stronger. So for public safety plans to come to Washington and explain their status and their issues, I think is very powerful.
Bailey, so you mentioned some of the good things that we can be doing at the state level to, or the tactics that you found to be most effective. But earlier you did mention some of the evolution of some of our opponents. For instance, in Colorado, what are the trends that you're seeing in terms of our opponents? How are they evolving, and what are, from what you've experienced, what are some of the most effective tactics that they've used?
That's a great question. I think, again, coming to the table with a significant amount of money is something that we're seeing them do repeatedly in states. And, it's a good strategy to tie the kind of lobbying you want to do to campaign funds in legal ways, of course. I don't know if they do it legally, but I would encourage you to do it legally if you're going to go down that road. But anyway, so the thing in Illinois, for example, with putting $20 million into a fund to advocate for legislative priorities, that's really concerning, because members who feel vulnerable, knowing that there's a war chest that could be used against them, makes it really difficult, I think, sometimes for us to break through. That doesn't mean it's impossible, and I still personally believe that, people power matters more, and if we're doing a good job making sure local folks are communicating to their legislators, making sure they're understanding the impact locally, I still think that can make a huge difference. But that amount of money is concerning, and that's why I think it's very important that we start early. I think that's one of the best things that we can do, and in Colorado in particular, knowing these reports are going to come out starting in the summer, thinking about how do we start messaging now? Is there research that we can do that's going to solidify the message that we have, so that folks hear what we have to say first and we're not always on defense? I think that's another way we can combat some of this, is to make sure that we're doing those local meetings, we're building those relationships, even if we don't feel like there's a threat this year, but making sure people are educated about what's going on. I think being a state legislator, I'm sure a member of Congress is even worse, but it's tough. You're dealing with a wide range of issues that you might have known nothing about before getting elected. And so it's our job to make sure they're educated about pensions. What does that mean? What is the impact? What's the health of the system? What are real solutions, so that they understand what those options are before they're presented with these, glitzy websites about, why a 401k style system is so much better. So I think the more we can do that early, really think about that relationship development, use local spokespeople and local members, I think that's going to be really helpful to beating back some of these tactics. And then also just knowing that money is out there. And if you see a study that comes out in your state that's completely opposite of what you know to be true about the system, let us know so we can dig in a little bit and see if we can find some of those ties, because we have had some real success in states when we've exposed John Arnold or an institution for taking his money and then just repeating his message. So just always keeping an eye out for those things, I think, is really helpful.
Great. And I think the last question we have from the audience has to do with something somewhat related to our discussion today, but obviously very important to NCPERS, which is our efforts with secure choice pensions, so the public-private partnership based at the state level to bring retirement security to folks in the private sector who do not have access to any employer-sponsored plan. The question was, what activities are we seeing, and what do we anticipate in 2015? So just to review, there are currently 8 states that have enacted legislation to, at a minimum, study the possibility of a public-private partnership in their state. They are the state of Massachusetts, California, Oregon, Vermont, Connecticut, Minnesota, and most recently, Illinois, which passed its secure choice in their lame duck in December. And then we have one other state, Maryland, which issued an executive order through the governor to create a study commission to see whether this type of concept is right for Maryland. So we're very pleased with 9 states actively pursuing this. Of the states that I just mentioned, I think Massachusetts is the furthest along, followed very closely by Oregon and California. The Illinois legislation, although it was the most recent, is also very promising in that the legislation was not to commission a study on the feasibility, but to actually have it implemented by 2017. In terms of what we anticipate for this calendar year, again, I think the theme of elections have consequences is applicable to secure choice and other state-based public-private partnerships. I think given where the state legislatures are, where 30 state legislatures are, both chambers are the majorities is the Republican Party, I think diminishes somewhat the possibility of more states taking this up this year. However, that said, I don't think that's a foregone conclusion, because there are a number of conservative states, for instance, Indiana, that have introduced legislation on this topic. So we are still trying to assess where we think we have the best chances. I think some of those chances, I think, begin with states that have introduced legislation last year, but for one reason or another, it did not make it fully through the legislative process. So in terms of a list, I don't have one off the top of my head at this point, but I think over the coming weeks, we will certainly develop that and let our audience and our full membership know where we are in terms of secure choice. So with that, let me make some final closing remarks, which is first, for those of you who've participated in this webcast for the entire duration, there is the ability for you to get a certificate of attendance for this webcast. There will be more information about that on the website, and a follow-up email detailing how to get your certificate of attendance. As it has been mentioned, in about 10 days, we will be hosting our healthcare symposium and legislative conference here in Washington, D.C. So you will get a chance to see both Bailey and Tony once again on Monday, January 26th. But we will be covering much more than what we just talked about today. Particularly on Sunday, the 25th, we will be devoting exclusively to healthcare issues. So hopefully those who are viewing this webcast will be joining us in about 10 days. Finally, I think this is something that both Tony and Bailey alluded to, which I wholeheartedly endorse, which is, active membership from this trade association is key. It's key for us generating intelligence to find out what's going on in the various 50 states, as well as what elected officials from those states are thinking here in Washington, D.C. So if we have not covered a state that you're from and you have some information for us, please share it with us. Please share it with me. Please share it with Bailey, and please share it with Tony. And so it just underscores the point that we need active membership to be our eyes and ears on the ground. And finally, I do want to thank Bailey Childress and Tony Roda for joining me today, as well as all of you for participating in this webcast. So thank you so much, and thank you, Bailey, and
Thank you so
thank you,
much.
Tony.
Absolutely.